Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Gaudium et Spes 22.com podcasts and YouTube videos. I am joined today by my partner in crime, Kale Zelden, who I've now probably done, this might be the show number 7 or 8 or something like that. I have you on, Kale, almost as often as my other partner in crime, Rodney Hauser. And Rodney is currently languishing on the beaches of Florida with his wife, since she's from Florida. They always go to Florida in the summertime. So, Rodney, if you're listening, hats off to you, buddy. Can't wait for you to come back. Have a good time. I wanted to have Kale on today to talk about two things. The second thing we're going to talk about is a bunch of churchy issues, inside baseball kind of stuff. But that's often dismissed as inside baseball. But it's important. It's important stuff, and I kind of bristle a little bit when people say, "Oh, stop talking so much inside baseball." It's important stuff.
Yeah, it
But the
is.
first thing we're going to talk about is a book that's been around since 2009 from an author named Iain McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary: The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. There it is, The Master and His Emissary: The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, Iain McGilchrist. And from what I get, I have not read, it's a very thick book. For those viewing can see, all right, I haven't read the entire thing. In fact, I've read only minuscule bits of it. After Kale brought it to my attention a few weeks ago, I decided I was going to order it. And McGilchrist makes a very interesting claim. I've read the introduction and conclusion and a new preface. That there are two hemispheres to our brain: left brain, right brain. And the left brain is the analytical, rational side, and the right brain is the imaginative, poetic, symbol creating side, out of which religion and art and all that sort of thing comes from. And that is what he calls the master. And reason, the left brain, is the right brain's emissary. And yet his thesis is that Western civilization has suffered from the fact that that order has been reversed, and that the left brain now dominates over the right brain. Also, I mean, just as a justification for the thesis, McGilchrist at the very beginning makes the claim, and it's just common sense, that okay, we've known for a long time that there are these two hemispheres of the brain, and that obviously should tell us something about ourselves. It means something, and we can't just lightly sort of dismiss these differences. That it might actually give us a window into how Western civilization has progressed if we analyze this properly. So, am I summarizing this correctly, Cal? I know you've read more of the book than I have, perhaps even all of it.
hmm Yeah, no, that checks. I mean, the thing that is striking to me, there've been several of these books that have come out, I would say, in the last decade or so, maybe decade plus. I call them in my own head, they're like they're the 500-year book, right? And what I mean by that is that there seems something there seems to be something very clear has occurred, and it's been about 500 years, right? If we want to talk about the modern world as roughly being about 500 years, there's Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. There's
Yeah.
Jacques Barzun's From Dawn to Decadence, and there's
Louis Dupre's Passage to Modernity.
right. There are these books that are really trying to wrestle really with modernity, and it feels like, and I think, and I don't think it's just a sort of a simple timestamp, like, oh well, it's been roughly 500 years, now we can kind of assess. But it feels like with all of these books, they seem to be hinting at or suggesting that we're at a place right now where we can start to think, kind of wrap our heads around what has transpired, right? And so, what one of my friends calls this the recession of modernity. Like, there's some, if you can imagine modernity as being something like a sort of a tide that moves in and sort of fills up all available space, and then tides come out, and so there's been this sort of pulling back of the forces of modernity at this point, and it's sort of giving us a little space, um by which we can start to see something that we were not able to see maybe even 25 years ago. And there's always sort of these hints. So I put this book kind of firmly in this camp, these big 500 year books. And, but they're not all the same. I think that what marks McGilchrist's book out for me is that it really does come to his biography. He is a PhD. He has a PhD in English literature. He started off his career as an English teacher and professor, and then went back to school and got his PhD in neuroscience and is medical doctor. So he's really an immensely educated man, and it comes at kind of quote unquote both sides. And you might remember this reference, but there was a famous um, lecture series about the sort of the two sides of academia. It was in the mid-century, I believe it was in England, and sort of talking about the world of humanities and the world of science. And there was sort of a clear kind of dividing line, and it became clear sometime in the mid 1900s, let's call it 1950, that the two spheres of academia simply did not talk to one another, and that they had lost some sort of connecting
Yeah.
thread. Is that ringing a bell to you? There was
Oh,
a famous
absolutely.
lecture.
I mean, even right through my academic career, that divide was there in my
Yeah,
university.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very real, and I think everybody kind of knows it. And but so McGilchrist is this sort of interesting figure because he straddles in it's one thing like I read up in humanities and poetry and theology and history and all these kinds of things, and I read a little bit of science and this, that, and the other. Like I'm a dilettante, right? I am not
Yeah.
a master, so to speak, or even a doctor of these disciplines. Whereas McGilchrist is. I mean, minted and he's got his minted and credentialed by the finest universities for quote unquote both sides. And his project grows out of his sense that these two sides were not talking to each other. And he opens up this whole thing, um you know kind of with a story. He felt that something important was not being talked about. And in part it starts with the question of, why do we have two sides of a brain? I mean, why do we even have these sort of two hemispheres? And for a long time people felt that the two hemispheres, one was kind of dumb and one was smart. But if you look, and what he does is he pries into the research there, and basically it was a frame problem. We saw one side as being dumb because we didn't appreciate what it was actually doing. And so come to find out, that both hemispheres know. Right? So then, what
Yeah.
kind of knowing do the hemispheres work? And so he uses as an illustration. He says, "Well, we developed this sort of bicameral brain because he says we require two modes of attention." And one mode of attention, and he says for most it's the right hand, which is controlled by the left hemisphere, right? So if you can imagine a kind of cross, so that my my right hemisphere controls the left side. So for most people, of course, it dominates on the right hand side. So there's no need to sort of get too caught up into that. It sort of
Yeah.
is what it is. But
Yeah.
okay, so and he says the right brain is the one that can hyper focus, it can grab, it can isolate, do those kinds of motions. Whereas, so therefore, the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is he understands it as sort of it takes in the kind of the big picture.
Yeah.
And ultimately, he says that's where meaning resides, in this sort of this sense we have of a big picture. And he uses the chicken as an illustration, and other animals. But if you've ever, and Larry, I'm sure you have chickens at the farm, you know
Yes.
exactly what I'm talking about. That chickens have to sort of see two things at the same time. They have to be able to see the distinction between like a bug and a piece of dirt, right? A piece of grit, right? And they have to kind of keep their eyes open for hovering predators, right?
Yes.
And so if you watch, barnyard chickens do their thing, they'll sort of poke around and poke around. All of a sudden, they'll kind of do one of these things, and they kind of turn that eye up, And I
Right.
looked
That's
at,
exactly what they do.
yeah, I was really struck by the same thing because we got chickens over COVID, right? So it was an interesting experiment for me and the kids, or my wife really and the kids. But they would sort of look up and do this thing, and then they go back to peck and look up like this. So so even in that sort of small way, you can see sort of these two modes. What McGilchrist will say, two modes of attending, right?
Right.
And he says, the problem is that we tend to look at the brain as having functions, and to a certain extent that is correct, but really it's this sense that both sides of the brain allow us to attend to necessary things. We might say the proximate, or the things right in front of our face, and then sort of the larger sense, of the sort of larger way of seeing the world, right?
Yeah.
And so his argument becomes essentially that the left hemisphere is really powerful. It can hyper focus. It's the brain of abstraction. It's the brain of think of like an Excel spreadsheet, right? It's the way of
Yeah.
sorting and processing information in bits and cells. And and it is extremely powerful. The problem is that the left hemisphere is not aware of what it doesn't know, right? And this comes into uh so he'll use this image of the master and his emissary. So if you could think about like the king and his attendants, or not even attendants, but like his privy council, something like that, right? So the king is sort of in charge of the whole thing, and he sends out his emissaries to do specific focused tasks, right? So what we see here is that the emissary, though, sort of believes, again, I'm using metaphors here, believes that it doesn't need the master, and that it can just kind of go ahead and do its business and kind of work its thing because the master is no longer necessary. And so that's sort of the crucial part for McGilchrist, is that and we live in a world that celebrates and pays the left hemisphere, right?
Good. Good.
If you think of
Yeah.
the scientific revolution as sort of being fundamentally the power of an unattached, unchecked left hemisphere. And so some people in your audience might be familiar with C.S. Lewis's notion of the discarded image, right? And so if
Yeah.
we can think of like the discarded image, like what happens to the world when I shut myself off from everything non-material? In fact, I even tell you that the non-material doesn't exist, right? Because that right hemisphere sort of forces you to sort of take more things into account than just what you can see, feel, touch, and taste, right? So in the
Yeah.
discarded image, what we give up, we get great power in that exchange. But what we lose is ultimately, and I think this is where it really resonates for folks like us. If we cut ourselves off from the right hemisphere, then we lose our sense of meaning. And therefore, well, McGilchrist will argue that we are, in essence, turning ourselves into a kind of autistic culture, one that is unaware of what it is unaware of.
Yeah. I think, boy, that's an excellent summary. And I'm kind of reminded a little bit when I was reading the introduction in particular of von Balthasar's Theological Aesthetics, Volume 1, right towards the beginning of his magnum opus. He talks about in a world that has forgotten beauty, that has no appreciation for beauty. The strange thing is that the true also then tends to go out
Yes,
the window.
yes, yeah,
He goes, the syllogisms will still be out there like rotary presses clattering away, cranking out syllogism out, but the motivation for attending to those truths is
yeah,
lost.
yeah,
Why should I pursue this rather than that,
right,
and so on? It reminds me of another statement. What breathes fire into our equations?
Mm.
You know, in some sense,
Yeah,
we can
yeah.
say, yeah, the left brain is great at making equations, but it's the right brain that breathes fire into those equations, that gives them meaning. That's the why those equations matter to us. And I think that's the significance for us of this book, you know, and why I want my readers to know about it and who McGilchrist is, because he's grounding this in science. He's grounding
Yeah.
this is not just wild speculation
That's right.
from some dude sitting in an armchair going, I have an idea.
Right.
And so it has anthropological, you know, implications in real world. And I think he's really onto something here, especially in light of the fact that we're not only a culture dominated by the absolute hegemony of the left brain.
Mhm.
The reason for that is, in some sense, that left brainness, what it gives us, makes us money. I mean, it's tied to the technocratic
Right.
economic engine. And now that goes back to the point you originally made about universities. One of the reasons why there's not just a divide in universities
Yeah.
between science and humanities. The sciences absolutely dominate the university landscape these days because they get grant money. Students come because they want to get jobs by
Yep.
majoring in so-called STEM majors. And now you see universities all over the nation, even Catholic ones, even other religious ones, eliminating whole humanities majors of all different kinds because most students don't want those anymore. And this has deleterious consequences for our culture, for our society.
Yeah.
Because it does. One of the things that strikes, and I'll let you comment.
No, no, no.
One of the things that strikes me, then, the other comment you made is we don't know what we don't know, you know, and the fact is we're so blinded to the truths presented to us by the right brain, we don't even pay attention to them. We're now no longer even aware that those truths should be there or that they're on the landscape, and they're just sort of dismissed.
Right. And you could imagine, you think of, I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to think that, if you think of a college of arts and sciences, right? Along with a college of engineering and a college of business, they're sort of looking at the landscape, and you're looking at kind of budget cut realities, and you sort of look across the aisle and you see, the idiots who study theology and the idiots who study poetry and the idiots who study fine arts. And they're like, you look at them, you're like, what do they bring to this university? I
Yeah.
don't see them bringing in it. I don't see them bringing in grants. I don't see them, being productive. I don't see them making any money for the university. So why, but we look at all the grants that I brought. I brought millions of dollars into this institution, from the federal grants for this initiative and that
Oh yeah.
initiative, or even more problematic, big pharma. I mean, where do you think big pharma, you know, they pay big money for the kind of research that they are doing because they know that they can translate, they can turn that lead into gold very, very easily. And so, they look across the aisle and, oh, that whole department is just expensive. And well, why are we letting those free riders? No, so I'm in my emissary brain here, right? Why are we letting those free riders over there who talk about beauty, goodness, and truth? I mean, why are we putting them on our welfare tab? Cut them, let's get rid of them. We know what's up. We know what these students need. They need better STEM. They need better business courses. They need to build better effectiveness. And you could fill in the blanks with all these
Yeah.
kinds of things. And
Yeah.
I do not think it's a stretch of the imagination at all. Not only do they think that, but I bet a lot of them actually would say it out loud.
Oh, they do. I mean, I've sat in faculty meetings on the university, and my university was very small, you know, not exactly a Yale. It wasn't Harvard in the Poconos. Let's just put it
Sure,
that way.
sure. Mhm.
And yet, that's kind of the point. Even in a tiny little Catholic university, DeSales University, you would have, and when you're like, curriculum debates would come up about, okay, the core curriculum, how many theology classes, how many philosophy classes, how many English classes, how many history classes. Those were always on the chopping block.
Yep.
It was never, no one ever said, well, let's cut these biology offerings or these chemistry offerings or these engineering offerings or anything like that. It was, and then you hear right from the mouth of some of these people on the floor of the faculty, well, why should we be even offering in the core curriculum these other courses? How many majors do these people have?
Right, right, right.
You know, in
That's
other words,
exactly right.
i.e., how much money do these
Yeah,
people bring into the university? And the implication is nothing,
yeah.
nothing except this, except this. All right. What would happen to the universities, and we'll see soon
Mm-hmm.
if the humanities went away.
Mm-hmm.
If they really, if the STEM people got their wishes and the humanities requirements were airbrushed right out of most core curricula, okay, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, will the university, even on the STEM side, start to suffer? My claim is that it is. And then, therefore, I will give a plug
Mm-hmm.
for, in some ways, places that I really loathe, major institutions like Yale and Harvard and Princeton that have multi-billion-dollar endowments. Kudos to them. They're going to keep their humanities departments
Sure.
because they can afford to. All right.
Yeah. Right. That's true. They're going to keep those things, and and that's it makes sense, right? The resource rich, allows you certain luxuries, right? And then I think our argument would be, of course, is they're not luxuries; they're absolutely
Yeah.
essential essence of the soul of the institution in the first place, right? Because it is only, and this is tired stuff, but it really bears repeating, right? The science is powerful because they can tell us what is very powerful. Neither of us are going to argue about
Right.
that.
Right.
But what McGilchrist's point is that yes, but what they're telling us what is, right? You really need to look at what is, and that's what the power of McGilchrist's book is, because he does a review of the literature, so to speak, on the divided brain, right? He has the chops. He brings in all the empirical observations that would be necessary to sort of quiet the the detractors, and he's saying, look, okay, fine, this is what's going on, but you are systematically cutting out the direction, the teleological direction of what it is we're for, right? And the reason is this: is it should not come as a surprise if you understand the way that the right hemisphere and left hemisphere work. The left hemisphere is extremely powerful, but it does not give you a proper sense of what should be done, right? And I think the perfect image of what McGilchrist is getting at, even though he doesn't really talk about this much, but it was there were two big huge movies last summer, Larry, if you recall. All right, the first one was Barbie, and we can have a conversation about that. And the second one was the movie about Oppenheimer, right? And to me, the ultimate expression of the power of the left hemisphere is what was able to be done through the Manhattan Project. Power staggering the mind, right? Godlike power to destroy worlds, right? And you could fill in the blank with the quip that
Yeah.
is
We have
attributed
become
to,
destroyer of worlds.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, the Oppenheimer, right? Exactly, right. And at no point did they ask seriously the question: should we be doing this? What are the
Yeah.
implications if we can actually do this? And of course, the cover story is that we had to beat the Nazis. Obviously, I'm sympathetic with beating the Nazis, right? Of course, right? But this is why I think that we are stuck, right? We are stuck as a civilization because what we unleashed in the middle of the century is still fundamentally not dealt with. And therefore, the power of McGilchrist here is that he's saying, yes, because we've forgotten half, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
We've forgotten half of what makes us human beings, because we have cut ourselves off from that which gives our life meaning and purpose.
Yeah. And the thing is that the technological paradigm, which is dominated by this kind of left brain thinking with the right brain occluded and
That's right.
forgotten,
That's right.
has gone global.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
now
we've
dom so
imported it, as you say. Yeah, right. We we
well,
we've
so
we've seeded the world, the whole globe, with this
yeah,
mentality.
and that goes to your point about asking the question: should we be developing atomic weapons?
Mhm.
Well, we have to because of the Nazis. And the thing is, when the left brain goes global and dominates globally, then the meme becomes this: well, unless we develop bioweapons,
Sure.
unless we develop AI soldiers, unless we
Absolutely.
develop even more powerful nuclear bombs, unless we weaponize space, the Chinese are going to do it anyway.
Right. Right.
And they probably will. And that's the conundrum that we face, because the entire globe is dominated by this thinking. It has this sort of vortex sort of effect where you get sucked into it, whether you want to get sucked into it or not, because of this awareness of, geez, we are, to quote Everett McGill Ulysses Ever McGill and Oh Brother
Yeah.
Where Art Thou,
Yeah.
we're in a tight spot here.
Yeah.
We're in a
Right.
tight spot here.
That's right.
You know, but I also mentioned one other thing, and then I'll get
Yeah.
back to you.
Yeah.
To go back to you know, real world consequences of these things. During the COVID pandemic, we heard over and over and over again, follow the science, follow the science. Now
And,
this, go ahead.
and trust, it's
Oh,
follow and
trust the
trust the
science.
science. I think there's two necessary words that we have to remember here.
Yes, ignoring utterly and completely the fact that scientists can lie and they can collude with one another and lie because there's millions, if not billions of dollars at stake here. And when they get linked up with the national security state and all that, and I don't want to sound like a tinfoil hat
No.
QAnon conspiracy nut, but this is real. I mean, Zuzana Zuboff wrote the famous thick book,
Yes.
Surveillance Capitalism, which
Yeah.
is just mind blowing. It's now an older
And,
book.
and if anything, undersells the reality.
Yeah,
To be
yeah. Well,
clear,
because yeah, undersells the reality, and now it's even exponentially worse. And so we were never allowed on social media or anything. And I see the Supreme Court just yesterday
really, really
didn't
sad.
allow for the lawsuit to go forward against, you know, the entities in the federal government that censored Facebook, censored X, censored Instagram, censored all of them, and pressured them into, well, they didn't censor them, but pressured them into censoring and labeling anything as disinformation that didn't fit the party line. Now, I'm not here to be an anti-vaxxer or any of that. That's not the point. The point is there was this implicit assumption, and I think this would be McGilchrist's point too. There was just simply this implicit assumption that if the scientific establishment says something, it is by definition dogma, right? It's now true. And without wondering about the real world consequences that the right brain might concern itself with. For example, and then I'll let you comment on this because you have kids. Uh, the fact, an image of a in 2021 or 2020, image of a first grade classroom with 30 kids that should be in it, empty, right? And they're all home on their computers. And when they do come back to class, they're spaced and they're all wearing masks. And now we understand the devastating consequences that that had on those kids. And even Anthony Fauci now admits, oh, that was a bad thing. We probably didn't need to do all of that closing of the schools and so forth. And yet we did it. And if you opposed it, are you against science?
Oh,
You're not following the science. So anyway, I'm on a little bit of a rant.
Do you want to kill grandma? Do you want to kill grandpa? I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
The
That is so true. Many of my friends said that to me.
Oh yeah, to me, yeah.
Because I am not vaxxed, and they would say to me, they would say, oh, I had actually friends say that to me. Oh, I guess you want to kill your grandmother now.
Right. Yeah. Larry, what we lived through is one of the most consequential things certainly in my lifetime. And I'm talking about the response to COVID and to the response to COVID and the lockdowns and the shutdowns and all that sort of stuff. And of course you're exactly right. This is left hemispheric thinking is tends to be singular factorial in its focus, right? And there was no real discussion that was had about any of these things. We trusted the experts, and it turns out that the experts have a malformed right hemisphere because they do not understand the big picture. They understand, certain things really, really well, and I give them credit for what they do know, but what they don't know, they don't know. And that, to me, that little bit of humility is the absolute crux of the crisis that we find ourselves in, because we have a massive wisdom deficit that in fact, we don't even know how to see it or to talk about it. I mean, you and I will be dismissed right now as by virtue of this conversation
Heck,
as
YouTube
beyond
might
the pale.
censor this. Who
Yeah,
knows?
beyond the pale. Like Kale and Larry are crazy. They're conspiracy theorists and all these sorts of things, right? And I would just suggest to the audience, if they'll let them listen to it, look, man, just take a look. Like, honestly, take a deeper look. That science is not magisterial in the way that you want it to be. right? Because when you hear people say trust the science or follow the science, right? In other words, that is an abnegation of authority, right? And it's placing the authority in the kind of the realm of the measurable. And when you place authority in the realm of the measurable, you lose the frame with which to say something is good or bad, period.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's the right brain that would have said to us, COVID is bad. And we wish more people were vaccinated and all that sort of thing. Like I said, I'm not anti-vax.
Yeah, and I would say even bigger than all of this issue, and it is a big issue, and we are not having the conversation, right? I mean, I think
Right,
that's the problem that you
right.
sense.
But the right
There's that.
brain would step back and say, but maybe there are bigger issues.
That's right. That's right. And
Maybe the well-being of children
right.
to be excluded from school is a higher concern here than
Well,
this particular virus.
Larry, just the notion that there's such a thing as a competing good. How do you sort through competing goods? I
Yeah,
mean, this is like, my goodness, people, you don't have to go read Thomas Aquinas for this. You can just like read the first couple of chapters of a very accessible book by C.S. Lewis called Mere Christianity, in which he kind of lays out every time you get into an argument, right? Means you think you're right and they are wrong. So
yeah,
therefore, what
yeah,
is the standard by which we're rendering these kinds of things? And isn't it important for us human beings to try to get to that standard? To
yeah,
sense like
yeah,
where are we getting this thing, right? And the idea of it can't be instinct, as we know, because I have an instinct to run into the burning building to save my family, and I have an instinct to stay out of the burning building to save myself. So which one wins? So therefore, we can have a discussion about the hierarchy of goods, and maybe even the summum bonum, the highest good. And maybe it's kind of important that we lay out what that highest good might be so that we can go ahead and create our hierarchy. I know we don't like hierarchies, right? You know, like these are
yeah.
bad. No, they're natural and normal and real, and ultimately they're supernatural, right? So therefore, maybe it's a good idea if we kind of plug ourselves into this long-standing conversation about the hierarchy of goods, because it might actually mean, not only the survival of the species, us, right, but its flourishing. And it seems to me that that is precisely the kind of meaning-bearing conversation that needs to happen, but we've cut ourselves off from this sort of right hemispheric worldview to have a meaningful conversation in that regard.
Yeah, I agree completely. And that's why I can't recommend more highly this book, even though I haven't read all of it yet. The Master and His Emissary.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce his name?
Iain McGilchrist.
Yeah, Iain McGilchrist. I got
Yeah.
it right then. Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
got it right. You called him Mark originally.
Oh,
Uh,
I'm sorry.
oh, I thought
Yeah.
maybe it was Mark Iain McGilchrist. I just don't
No.
want the viewers to be confused.
Yeah, my
Or
apologies if I made that mistake. It's Iain
oh,
Sir Iain McGilchrist, I believe. So
Sir Iain McGilchrist, a brilliant book, a brilliant guy. And I think the viewers and listeners kind of understand why it's important. It's not just that this book is important; the issue is an important one. And as our technological prowess increases exponentially with AI and genetic engineering and so on, the question of values, the question of the good, the question of ought we do these
that's
things
right.
is going to be ever more pressing. Do you have any last words on this before we move on?
No, it's good. It's so much. I mean, my goodness, we could do a 13-part series on this. So
Oh, we
it's so
could.
much depth and
Do you
richness
teach it in your
here.
class there?
I teach versions of it. There's a little 40-page booklet that I'm going to be using actually this term coming up. It's a book that he wrote as a kind of almost a little digest for this massive book, and it's called The Ways of Attending: How Our Divided Brain Constructs the World. And I do want to say one last thing here,
Sure.
because I do think it's important. He says, attention is not just receptive, but actively creative of the world we inhabit. How we attend makes all the difference to the world we experience. And nowadays in the West, we generally attend in a rather unusual way, governed by the narrowly focused, target driven left hemisphere of the brain. Forget everything you thought you knew about the difference between the hemispheres, because it will be largely wrong. It is not what each hemisphere does, they are both involved in everything, but how it does it that matters. And the prime difference between the brain hemispheres is the manner in which they attend. For reasons of survival, we need one hemisphere in humans and many animals, the left, to pay narrow attention to detail, to grab hold of things we need, while the other, the right, keeps an eye out for everything else. The result is that one hemisphere is good at utilizing the world, the other better at understanding it. So use and understanding, right? You back and forth. Absent, present, detached, engaged, alienated, empathetic, broad or narrow, sustained or piecemeal, attention has the power to alter whatever it meets. The play of attention can both create and destroy, but it never leaves its object unchanged. How you attend to something or don't attend to it matters a very great deal. Right. So you can kind of see,
Yeah.
so it's not just like, oh, do I see this or see that? And it's much more, it's almost like constructive of a world, or destructive, right?
Yeah.
It seems to be
Once
the
again, it
balance.
reminds me of von Balthasar,
Yeah. Yeah.
where he talked about the priority of the contemplative
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
over the active, and
Yeah.
he actually believed, obviously, very passionately in the active side of the apostolate and
You
all
know who
that.
else? You know who else kind of predicted what McGilchrist is getting into? Is the youngish Joseph Ratzinger, Father or Monsignor Ratzinger, in his book The Introduction to Christianity from 1968, and in it he's seeing this stuff
Yes.
manifest in a way, and I cannot recommend that opening section more to people. I had not read it since I was 19 or 20, and I just picked it up about 3 4 weeks ago, and I was really struck. Number one, it's great. I mean, he's just
Yeah.
he's an amazing writer. But here it is. He's a young guy in 1968, and he's seeing exactly what McGilchrist is kind of seeing. Now McGilchrist will give you the back end of it, right? He'll sort of he'll show you
Yes.
how it's all kind of working, but he says, yeah, we're obsessed with myths of control. And so yeah, so wait.
Yeah, I'll just plug that book too. Introduction to Christianity by Joseph Ratzinger, I think, is one of the greatest theological texts of the 20th century.
Yeah,
And it was absolutely instrumental in my
yeah,
intellectual debate. It
that's
was
cool. I
revolutionary
didn't know
when
that.
I
That's
read it.
cool.
I was blown away. I too read it when I was like 20 years old, and
Yeah.
I was blown away. Now, it's not an easy slog,
No.
not at all, but it is well worth the read. But I want to say one last thing, and then we'll go on about contemplation in
Yeah.
Balthasar's Register. For Balthasar, and this goes to McGilchrist, contemplation is not merely receptive. Contemplation
Mm-hmm.
is in and of itself an active
That's right.
receptivity
That's right.
where the questing soul, the questing
Mm,
person, in a sense, he doesn't use this language, pays attention in a certain way, okay, and attends to the truths of God in a certain way. So it's not just like your brain just becomes this absolutely open thing into which revelation gets poured. There's an active element here, which is why Balthasar holds up the Marian principle, the contemplative receptivity of the Virgin Mary in her fiat, be it done unto me according to
that's
thy
so
word.
good. Oh, it's so good.
That her fiat was generative, her fiat
Yes.
was not simply receptive,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
therefore her subjectivity, her engraced subjectivity,
Yeah.
is in a sense why we need to take on Mary's engraced
That's
subjectivity
so
as well.
good.
But anyway,
That's so good.
that's
That's so
actually
good.
Ratzinger. I had an
Ah,
article in the 1996 summer issue of Communio on that very
okay.
topic, and it's
Oh,
Balthasarian mainly.
just quickly on Communio. I loved your conversation with Father Fessio the other day. It was really great to sort of hear the back end of that story. Very
Yeah,
cool. Anyway, just as a
Fessio
fan, just as a
he's just
fan.
he's a giant, and that reminds me too. I want to remind my viewers, Communio is currently running a bunch of sales. So
Great.
go to the Communio International Catholic Review webpage, and you will see that they're offering a bunch of sales right now. Anyway,
Unpaid people, unpaid.
I am unpaid for that, although my this blog is featured on the Communio webpage.
Ah,
It's like the official podcast of Communio.
love it,
But
love it.
anyway, let's move on to some ecclesial issues now.
Yeah, please.
The Father Rupnik affair.
Ah, yes. Oh, yes.
Mark, right? Mark Rupnik. Maybe
Marco
that's
Rupnik. Marco
Marco.
Rupnik.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I'm not going to say anything. What say ye on the Rupnik affair?
There was a chance, maybe as recently as 6 months ago, that Pope Francis and his minions could have done something to distance his papacy with the sordid tale of Marco Rupnik.
Yeah.
And I feel like we have passed that point, so that I believe the papacy of Pope Francis will forever be imaged and twinned with Marco Rupnik and the mosaics from hell.
Yeah.
I
I want to
really do
plug.
believe that, and it
Uh,
did not have to be the
it
case.
didn't. That was saying that's the puzzling thing. Okay, as we're going to get into, we're going to dig into this. I want to give a big plug, big, huge plug to my dear friend Christopher Altieri, the journalist, who has done article after article after article in Catholic World Report on the Rupnik affair. I mean, Christopher used to work for Vatican Radio. I mean, he married to an Italian woman. He lived in Rome and had all kinds of. The dude knows his stuff. Okay, and he has essentially been saying the same thing that you're saying, which is what is going on here. There is an enigma here that has to be answered. This is a man who was kicked out of the Jesuits because he was
to be clear,
credibly
so the Jesuits themselves thought that he was
guilty.
could no longer remain a Jesuit in good standing. The Jesuits
Yes.
kicked him out and said, "No, bad guy, bad guy."
Yes, that he's a sexual predator, that he did not molest minors.
Unrepentant, right?
An unrepentant sexual predator. He didn't molest minors, but he sexually molested via psychological coercion a group of nuns in Slovenia that were under his charge, and fed them a lot. So, in a sense, too, there's an almost demonic, ritualized nature to his sexual predation, where he apparently told some of the women, we're going to have a threesome, which is kind of like the Trinity, and
right.
and me sharing my love with you is a reflection of the divine love. All this kind of garbage, which is and he also absolved the woman in the confessional that he had had sex with of that sin, and that for that he was excommunicated. And his excommunication was almost immediately lifted. And the only person in the church that can lift an excommunication like that is the Pope. All right. And when queried about this, did Pope Francis lift the excommunication? The Vatican is it's just crickets, absolute silence. Now, supposedly, there's this investigation of Rupnik going on right now, I guess in the DDF or someplace else in the Vatican clergy department. I don't know, but that investigation has gone silent, has gone quiet mode.
Well,
Have you heard anything about it? No.
no. Well, it gets invoked whenever a journalist or two decide to do their responsible work, which is to hold power accountable, right? I mean, that right?
Yeah.
That's what I thought journalism was about, rather than being thanked for their holy silence or their respectful silence on the matter, like Pope Francis said over the Christmas season, thanking the journalists basically for not asking questions. In other words, thanking journalists for
Yeah.
not being
There's
journalists.
a question in the Italian there of whether it was mistranslated, what he was really trying to say. I know the folks over at Where Peter Is made a big deal. It's a mistranslation. It's a mistranslation. He didn't thank them for their silence.
What did he thank him for then?
What was he thanking them for then? But some would say he was thanking them for their decorum, for their
Okay. In other words,
sobriety, for their sobriety. But
words,
you know what? Come on.
running cover, right?
Yeah.
And look, I've tweeted about this, and whatever, tweets are tweets, right? But the job of a journalist is to report true things. The job of the reporter is not to run cover for people who need cover. It's just
Yeah.
plain and simple. If you're
Yeah.
doing that, you're in the business of public relations, right? And a public relations outfit is being paid to lie, you might say, or I could be nice and say a public relations firm is to get out in front and to control the narrative and control perceptions. Like, okay, fine, we get what it is, right? It's disaster control, and so therefore, anyway, so when the journalists do their job and ask the question, they'll then quickly, the Vatican officials will quickly cart it. Well, there's an investigation on underway, ongoing, so I can't comment on that. Come on, I mean, Larry.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
come on.
yeah. I can't comment on that. Right. That's just, it's such a smokescreen. It's such a deflection. Now, along these lines, you were talking about, journalists speaking truth to power, to use a cliche.
Mhm.
Just recently, and you sent me a link to an article written by a woman, her last name Chicone.
Yeah,
Uh,
Mrs. Coon. Yeah.
yeah, wrote an article because the Vatican communications dude, Rufino, was giving a talk here in the United States, I believe in Atlanta.
I
Yeah.
think it was. Yeah, I think it was
And it was
Atlanta.
just a sort of boilerplate, anodyne, sort of usual ecclesio speak about dialogue and synodality and diversity and all this
Yeah,
garbage.
well, let me. I'm going to read from the article. This
Go,
is from
you go ahead. You
This is
go.
from Cecilia Saccone, and she says, when Dr. Paolo Ruffini took the stage at the Catholic Media Conference in Atlanta on Friday, June 21st, you could still hear people scraping mashed potatoes off their plates and stirring cream into their coffee. We've all been there, Larry.
That's right.
The prefect for the Vatican's dicastery for communications began his plenary address to the room of Catholic media professionals by apologizing for his accent. Accent or not, the Italian prefect made one point abundantly clear. The Vatican would not be removing the artwork of credibly accused serial sexual abuser Father Marco Rupnik from its website. I sat at a table in the back of the room while Ruffini delivered his prepared address, referencing the road to Emmaus and the challenge of artificial intelligence. While he was speaking, I made the connection that it was Ruffini who had made the decision to continue using Rupnik's art in Vatican communications, despite repeated calls for the art to be removed from church communications out of respect for the victims. As Ruffini was primarily delivering a spiritual reflection, it seemed imprudent for me to shout, "Stop using Rupnik art!" And yet, I could not take his warnings about artificial intelligence or loneliness bred by social media seriously, knowing that he was actively using the copyrighted art of a man who had repeatedly sexually abused religious sisters while creating his mosaics. None of the previous plenary speakers had opened up the floor to the room of journalists and media professionals, so it was a surprise when Ruffini concluded with the invitation to ask questions. My heart began beating quickly, knowing that it was inevitable that someone would confront Ruffini about his failure to listen to victims. What happened next was a whirlwind. Colleen Dool from America Magazine asked about
Stop
why
a
the
second. Stop a
yeah,
second. I love Colleen Dool. She's really good. Anyway, go
right.
ahead.
Yeah, so from America Magazine, asked hardly a right wing, rag,
Right.
but
Yeah.
nonetheless, it's a good magazine, right? Asked about why the Vatican continues to use Rupnik's work on its website, Ruffini gave a scattered response, repeating several times that there was a juridical process that needed to be followed, and echoing the words of Pope Francis, "Who am I to judge?" claimed that removing the art was not the merciful Christian response.
Yeah. Can you say tone deaf?
I mean, unbelievable,
I mean,
unbelievable.
first off, that we're not the question isn't should we remove his physical mosaics from real churches around the world. This is the fact is that the dicastery for communications is using his artwork on their web page. How hard would it be for the Vatican to simply swap out Rupnik's art for something from Raphael or Michelangelo or anything else that they hold
Yeah,
the copyrights for? Some of the
yeah.
greatest artworks in the history of humanity,
Yeah,
all right, at their
yeah,
fingertips, and they
yeah,
put shark eye icon Rupnik
yeah,
and his stuff on there. Easily could brush that stuff right out of there. And he claims, well, that would be unchristian to do
yeah.
that.
Well, yeah, as I quipped on Twitter, I said, it's a real shame that the Vatican does not have access to any other art, that they could use for any of their materials. It's such a shame that we have nothing in the tradition that would, allow us to avoid this really embarrassing use of Rupnik's art. It's such a shame. But all cynicism and sarcasm aside, it truly is remarkable. And he then at some point, he says, I just want to read this last little part. Um,
Yeah.
Many, let's see, da, 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 uh, then Paulina Guzik, international editor for Our Sunday Visitor News, asked a follow-up question, pointing out that Ruffini had not mentioned anything about Rupnik's victims in his initial response. The prefect immediately, wait, the prefect immediately got defensive, saying that it is clear that the church is close with victims, then posed a possibly rhetorical question in return. He asked if Guzik and the audience really believed that removing Rupnik's images from the Vatican website would be an act of solidarity with the victims. And of course,
And
the
people
audience,
shook their heads
they're
vigorously
like,
up and
yes,
down.
yes.
Yes, yes, it would
And then
be.
he responds, really? Ruffini confidently chastised the crowd. Well, I think you're wrong. I think you're wrong. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And to me, the story it's a great article. It's just quick, it's short, but it really captures,
It's
for
in a
her,
and it's in a publication online called Catholic Vote, I believe.
catholicvote.org. Yeah, it's really good. And we could put it in the show notes. But it's a it's exactly right. And you're sort of asking yourself, what in the blob, how does the blob not understand that we're not even talking about removing the mosaics at Lourdes or removing the mosaics in the Knights of Columbus Chapel or these other places. I mean, I would argue that those have to come down too. But let's
Me
just put
too.
that.
But
Let's just put
there's
that
an
on the side for a
argument to be
second.
made for
Yeah,
no, but I would say
yeah,
yes, take those
yeah.
down too.
But this stuff is shocking. In other words, I think what Cecilia correctly points out is that it's a choice. It's a deliberate choice to continue to use the images of this strangely protected man. And Larry, I don't understand. You have more experience with the Vatican and Vatican types, and also I do not understand their attachment to Rupnik's work. Okay, even if you think it's the best thing since Raphael or whatever, what's going on here? Help me understand why this papacy in particular, and yes, as people pointed out, John Paul liked him, and that fine, that's not my point. But why are they so attached to him now and still?
Yeah, first I'll say about this was in a thread that I posted that article, or
Yeah.
no, an article by Chris Altieri on this, and my good friend Andrew Lakutis, and he's a good guy. He veers towards the where Peter is wing of things, but he's a really solid guy, nice guy, I like him. But he took me to task, or took the whole thing to task. That hey, let's not take down this art. It has value and so on. But I sort of lost my train of thought here. Now we were talking about what was you were talking about before, right before I started
Well,
commiserating.
I said, even putting the mosaics on the side, right, which would require a deinstallation, and I get all that, right? But why are they so attached to this man's art?
Yeah,
This predator's art.
and that was the question I addressed to Andrew in a sense in the thread, which was why the strong defense here of this guy? I mean, okay, I get it. Maybe we shouldn't tie so closely an artist with his malfeasance, but in this case, I think we should. But nevertheless, why the defense? In other words, there's something strange and bizarre going on here. And one, I tell you what, you ask me is, oh, I don't really have any Vatican connections or anything, but I was a seminarian. I've been in the theological guild that has a lot of priests and religious in it. I know, and my wife teaches, was dean at a seminary, and
Yeah.
I know the seminary world. I know the clerical world.
Okay.
And the thing there are two things at work here: clericalism, which Pope Francis is constantly, bringing up as a horrible blight on the church. I think there is a clericalistic element here. As
Little bit.
Duncan Stroik, the architect at Notre Dame, has an article out where he says the art is ugly. The art is horrifically bad. All right. So why are we clean? And the conclusion is he's because Rupnik is a priest and a Jesuit, and that gave him, in other words, Stroik is complaining that when there's this argument that, well, this guy's artwork must have some value to it because it's everywhere. And what Stroik points out, though, is that's not necessarily true. The fact of the matter is because he was a priest, it was almost as if he had no competition. That lay artists need not apply. He was a Jesuit, he was a priest, and so there was this, and so there's this wondering if maybe, just maybe, if Rupnik is severely, disciplined and so laicized or whatever, then maybe certain truths are going to come out about how this artwork got approved.
That's
You
really
know,
interesting to me. No,
and
that's
and it's going to show the dark underbelly of the church's sort of clericalism and all of this and privilege. I mean, as I pointed out in the thread on Facebook, you know what? The ubiquity of this guy's art does not argue for its value. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, which was dominated everywhere by the most horrifically awful liturgical
oh
art,
yeah,
the most
oh yeah,
awful art. You know, it is true, for example, too. John Paul did like Rupnik's art, but you know what? John Paul is the greatest ecclesiastical hero of my lifetime. I think he's one of the greatest popes of all time. So take this within that context. I don't think John Paul had the greatest aesthetic sensibilities on the face of the. When you look, for example, to his credit, he built this church in Nowa Huta in Poland when he was archbishop there.
yeah.
It was the first new church built in Poland, and he had to pull all kinds of strings and all kinds of shenanigans to get this church built. He finally gets this church built, and it is a brutalist, minimalist monstrosity. It's the ugliest damn church you'd ever want to see in your life. Now, maybe he was constrained by Soviet bloc architects and say you must make it look brutalist and all that. But I don't know. So the point is, I don't really care that John Paul liked Rupnik's art. That's neither here nor there. The question, though, is did clericalism play a role? Then the other thing, I'll let you talk. The other thing is more cynical. And I think the cynicism is called for. Does Rupnik know something? Does he know where the skeletons in what closets are? Does he have dirt on people? That is something that has to be seriously entertained, because his ulterior. Go ahead.
It reminds me of. It reminds me of the internet. The international man of mystery and finance who did not kill himself in prison.
Oh yes,
Pleasure
Epstein.
Island guy. Yeah,
Jeffrey Epstein.
I mean, that's what it reminds me of. Honestly, it's like what does he know? Like what?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, to me, it's a fair question because, you try to, play Occam's razor here, right? And Occam's razor just fails in this story because the easiest thing to do is to pull the images off the website. I mean, I am a technical noob. I'm an idiot. I could do it.
Yeah.
So in other words, someone is making the decision to not do it.
Well, the two things. First, exactly. The fact is, there seems to be an effort, and with Ruffini, I think I called him Rufino. Ruffini, he got blustery and defensive. That bespeaks the fact that he has a motive for wanting those things on there. If it was some underling that had put him up there and he thought, okay, you guys have a point, maybe we'll look in. He could have easily diffused the situation and said, we'll look into this. You guys really have a serious point. This could offend victims and we're going to take a look at it. No, he got defensive, which means that he's got skin in this game for some reason. Okay. And the skin in the game might be a very positive effort to rehabilitate Rupnik, to actually rehabilitate the guy, to put him back in the public eye and say, we're going to keep this guy. And by the way, he's still in Rome. Rupnik is still a Rome. He's still a priest. He's still doing his little art in his little studio there in Rome without any, but the judicial ceremonies are still going on and so on and so forth. And here's what you do. All right. You suspend him from his priesthood without pay, while the judicial thing is going on, to show some semblance of closeness to his victims, but they don't.
And I would say, as a layman, that this story, I won't let this story go because it is McCarrick stereo, right? It has the same stench of cover up and old boys network and yes, Larry, clericalism. I mean, when Francis was first elevated to the papacy, gosh, 10 years ago now, right? 11 years ago, when he first started talking about clericalism, I was jumping up and down. I'm like, yes, please, let's talk about one of the elephants in the room. And one of the elephants in the room is the problem of clericalism in the church. And so it is a brutal irony that I have had to undergo personally, is that my distaste for the for the current regime, for Pope Francis in particular, is precisely because I see him as a hypocrite, a total hypocrite when it comes to preaching about clericalism on the one hand, and then with McCarrick and Zanchetta and Rupnik and all of these characters and all the
Yeah.
other guys, and I lose all their names because it's just we're awash in the kind
Yeah.
of hypocrisy that we see on patrol, and it is a reminder one more time, right? It's a reminder to me that my church doesn't give a rat's behind, really, when it comes down to it, does not care about abuse victims. It does not care about the abuse that is carried on in her name, right? So Cecilia ends her article with a banger of the paragraph. He says, on Friday, Dr. Paolo Ruffini revealed. Now, remember, who is he, Larry? He's the head of communications
Yeah.
at the Vatican. Dr. Paolo Ruffini revealed that Rome does not listen to victims. But that room was filled with Catholic journalists who know and believe that Jesus has come not to affirm those in power, but to comfort and rescue the least among us. There's
Yeah.
reason for great hope, if not in the men who are in charge, at least in the God who is raising up dedicated members of his church to heal the sick and save the lost. I am not as such a sanguine mood at the end as Cecilia is. I am struggling in confidence. I have the opposite of confidence in the ability of the church to self-correct, change its course.
Yeah.
Where are the sackcloth and ashes? Where's
Look,
where's the mea culpa? Where's the fasting? Where's the I'm sorry, please forgive us? It's
look,
not on parade.
there isn't. Look, when I was in the seminary, late 70s into the mid 80s, it I always say there were two types of people that I met in the seminary. The greatest people I've ever known in my life that I would entrust my life to in a moment of crisis, and the most horrifically scary, monstrous people I've ever known in my life. The sickest people I've ever known in my life. And those of us who were sane would sit around and we'd watch guys get ordained that were in the sicko category.
Yeah.
And we would say to each other in our naivete at the time, what is that guy's bishop thinking? What is the seminary thinking? Everybody knows the guy's a gloob. I mean, everybody knows that the guy's a pervert and a weirdo. When a guy struts down the hallway at the seminary with a new perm that he got at the beauty shop, wearing tight shorts and a cutoff shirt, walking up and strutting his stuff, and you say to yourself, "What the?" And then he becomes a priest. Okay, so the sex crisis hits the fan, and I and some of my former seminary friends who are now priests were saying to each other, okay, maybe now the church gets it. Maybe now that it's costing the church billions of dollars in bankruptcy, the church will finally get it. And hope, I had some hope there right after 2002 and so forth, and the Dallas Charter. Okay, maybe we're going to do something. Ratzinger discipline Maciel, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, no. It is very clear now under this pontificate that this church still does not get it, doesn't understand how livid lay people are about this, and that their credibility is shot, absolutely shot. I don't want to hear one more word from this church about climate change until they start talking about sexual abuse change. That's my statement.
No, it's just the truth. And you realize that all this other stuff is smokescreen. The social
Yeah.
justice stuff, good and bad, right? The good part of that and the bad part of that, political and all this sort of stuff is like, no, yeah, these are all deflections. All of this is deflection. And here, and I'm going to drop a bomb for my conservative friends. The Eucharistic processions, they're deflection. Sorry,
Yeah.
not sorry. No, not every.
Yeah.
Look, it's real, but that is even being pushed forward as a kind of like thing to do. It's part of the deflection, and I'm
Yeah.
tired of it.
I think that the Eucharistic revival is a good thing and it has beneficial aspects, but that doesn't change the fact that you're absolutely right. It is also a deflection, right? And as a deflection, it's bad.
Yeah, and it's not living out the gospel. That's for darn sure, right? And I'm reminded of what is it that Sinclair quote, the Upton Sinclair quote. And I wonder if this is appropriate. See what you think about this. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. Now we can
That's right.
Jigger with the nouns there a little bit, right?
David Dean quotes that in his book, The Tyranny of the Banal. Great Upton
Wow.
Sinclair quote.
Wow.
Great quote. Yeah.
But it's difficult to get a group of priests to understand something when their position power, influence depend on them not understanding it.
Okay. Oh boy.
Sorry.
No, this up. I mean, gosh, we're well into this now. The thing is this, you know, where are the prophets in our amongst our priests? Where are those willing? I didn't agree with everything, for example, that Daniel Berrigan stood for, but
Sure.
where are in a sense the equivalent of the Dan Berrigans
Yeah.
today,
Yeah.
in the clerical world, standing up and saying, like Gandalf to the Balrog, you shall not pass.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and willing to die, or at least at the time it looked like Gandalf was
Yeah.
dead.
Yeah.
All right, for that, because I noticed something. And I love all the priests and bishops that I have interviewed on this show, and I don't mean to cast aspersions at all. I mean, I've interviewed Bishop Barron, who I love, Bishop
Yeah.
Conley, who I love,
Me too.
various
Yeah, me
priests
too.
who I absolutely, seminary rectors who I adore. And yet, what comes through very clear is, not for all of them, but some of them will even say to me in advance, here are the topics we cannot discuss. This is what I cannot say. And then I get emails and letters from certain priests in particular to say, Larry, the reason why we love you is you say things that we're not allowed to say. Now, in their defense, this is not paranoia. In their defense, their paycheck depends on it. And it's not simply a question of their paycheck.
And the work that they do with their parish, the work that
they could be suspended.
Yeah, totally.
They could be suspended from their priesthood. They could be sent packing. Okay, so when I say where are the prophets in I don't mean to cast any aspersions at anyone in particular, but it just does seem to be a deficit of people, of priests speaking out. But we can understand why, because the Upton Sinclair thing makes the point.
Yeah. So we're at the tail end of a ratcheting effect that extends pretty far back, the better part of 150 plus years, right? And we are now at the point that it is harder to be a faithful prophetic priest than it is to be a priest who goes along with the racket. And the racket is pretty clear. Rupnik has played it supremely, fantastically. McCarrick has played it supremely, fantastically.
Yeah.
Both of them got what they wanted. And you would think that the church would be in a unique position to stand up for what is right and true and beautiful. And yet, it seems that there's nothing further is going to happen. Like, I just have no faith that they're going to course change here.
Well, like 2 or 3 years ago, the Vatican came out with the results of that famous study on the McCarrick affair, in which essentially they deflected all the blame back on the dead man who couldn't defend himself, John Paul, and whitewashed the role of Pope Francis, even though Pope Francis had to know about all of this, that Pope Benedict had in fact put some strictures on McCarrick that weren't followed. But and then Pope Francis goes out of his way to rehabilitate the guy, and then all of a sudden the doo-doo hits the fan back here in the United States, and McCarrick is in big trouble. And then all of a sudden Francis backpedals. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is that the Rupnik affair is not a one-off deal. There's a pattern in this papacy. McCarrick, Rupnik, but also think of a Bishop Zen. I think his name is pronounced Zenketa or Zenketa. Who was credibly accused of abusing seminarians under his charge. Instead of being immediately laicized or put on trial, canonical trial, he's given a job at the Vatican. All right. He was also accused of financial misdoings.
A make-work job.
A made-up job. And the reason why I mentioned that he was also accused of financial misdeeds is because the makeup job had to do with Vatican finances. Okay, so it's like putting an art thief in charge of security at the Louvre,
or me in charge of the cookie jar. It's like, guess what? I'm going to eat them.
And Zenketa and McCarrick and Rupnik are not the only ones. Altieri's good. Go read Altieri's art. He lists like 4 or 5, 6 examples of where this pope has turned a blind eye and to sexual abuse, and actually shielded some of his favored clerics.
So Larry, what is the definition of scandal?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm sure there's several. The catechism definition. I don't know off the top of my head. That's a stumbling block,
Yeah, and cause the deflation and the enervation of the faith of us,
Yes.
the flock.
Oh,
We're the flock, right?
there's man, you and I are so on. I could talk to you for 8 hours, Kale. I swear to God,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
the fact is, to me, I mean, I don't agree with the traditionalists that Pope Francis is a heretic. I don't think he's a heretic. I don't think he's taught
He doesn't
heresy.
need to be. Here's the thing. He doesn't need
No,
to be a heretic.
no. Here's the deal.
Fine. That'll get sorted out. The
No,
bigger scandal, or a scandal that I can care about and yell about and talk about, is the malfeasance of governance. That's what I can
yes,
talk about.
yes. And the fact is, because of that malfeasance of governance, and not just in terms of the sexual abuse,
Mhm.
but in terms of who he's promoted, who he's
Mhm.
given red hats to, like that idiot McElroy out in San Diego, giving so much power to that thug Supich in Chicago,
Mhm.
and it's just, it goes on and on. What it does, it has the net effect of demoralizing. I think you were sort of mentioning this
That's right.
before.
That's right. That's
It,
right.
it, it, it there's an entire generation of Catholics right now, faithful Catholics, who are utterly demoralized by this papacy. And that is, I mean, I talk to seminary people. I don't want to mention any names who tell me, yes, most young seminarians today tend to be very conservative, and they're, excuse me, and they're very inspired by the examples of Pope John Paul, but also most especially Pope Benedict.
Yeah.
But there's absolutely no Francis effect. There's no Francis bounce in vocations. Very, very, very few seminarians say, I came to the seminary because I was inspired by Pope Francis. In fact, it's the opposite. I came to the seminary in spite of Pope Francis, and I look back to Popes Benedict and John Paul for my guidance. All right, there is this powerful, and then those seminarians are castigated as rigid backwardists,
Of course.
blah blah blah, all this kind of stuff. They need psychological re-education. It's utter tripe.
Well, and not only is it utter tripe, and and this is maybe this is plain landing zone here. It's demoralizing in precisely a time in which it would be really nice if the entire Vatican apparatus, scaling all the way up to the very top, the Vicar of Christ, Pope Francis himself. It would be really nice if they would do something to buoy the spirits and the faith of those of us who are trying to live and move and have our,
Yeah,
and do our thing in the world. And that, and yet instead of going after problems, they go after niche things, and so it's like, and you and I've had this conversation, and I don't want to derail the conversation with another conversation about trads, right? But I will say this, as someone who goes to a Novus Ordo parish, where I'm here at the Abbey, you know um that what they think they will accomplish if they really do enact the kill shot, the headshot to the TLM, is so disgusting, so pathetic,
yeah,
so craven in in purpose, that it will do fine. Isolate the isolated already. But what about folks like me, folks like you? It's like,
yeah,
I like traditional things. Traditional things are good. There's no reason why
yes,
the TLM has to be suppressed. If it's irrelevant, like you suggest, let it be. Let it
yeah,
be. Let it be a little eddy on the side. Heck, let it even turn into an oxbow lake, what I've called it before. Fine. What's the threat? And
yeah,
I think the threat, as I can see it, is that right now it's a marking error, right? In terms of percentage, right? It's in the margin of, it's within the plus or minus, right? But when our boomer friends and family go off to their eternal reward, a rounding error becomes quite substantial,
yeah,
quite substantial.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and instead of bringing them into the fold, which I do believe is what Benedict's desire was, I think it was a smart move, contrary to the folks who think it was bad. The smart move on Benedict's part is that he recognized that in time, especially, look, my mom always says, your prayer should always be, Lord, this thing that is on my heart, bless it if it's of your will and block it if it's not, right? So my the only way that you could see the TLM as a threat is if you believe that it is a bad thing in and of itself, And guess what, Larry? It can't be by definition.
I agree. I mean, Pope Benedict said it best. That which was sacred for millennia or longer could now not be held in contempt. I'm
That's exactly
paraphrasing him,
right. No, it's
but
exactly
the
right.
fact is, I mean, the journalist, the excellent journalist Diane Montaigne, who I really
Oh yeah,
like, writes
yeah.
for the National Catholic Register. She's accredited to the Holy See. She speaks Italian fluently. She's well connected in Rome. I've met her once in George Weigel's apartment during the synod last
Oh,
year,
that's funny.
and so I did have a chance to interact with her personally. And the fact is, she is now reporting that there is, in fact, a document sitting on a desk in a Vatican dicastery that is going to be that kill shot. She doesn't use the word kill shot, but I like
That's
your
me.
phrase.
That's me. Yeah, yeah.
That's going to be the kill shot. And so the question are, everybody's waiting. Are they going to pull the trigger or not? And everyone caught, some people got a little glimpse of hope because the Pope met with the head of the Institute of Christ the King the other day and said, oh, keep going what you're doing, blah, blah, blah. I see it. For those who don't know, that they're along with the FSS, the Society of St. Peter, the people that say the old mass, and that's part of their charism. That's their founding mission.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's saying, yeah, you guys can go ahead and do that. I actually think that what will be done is that the Latin Mass will be sequestered
Correct.
in
Correct.
those single small little uh, uh, religious orders, and it's going to be suppressed every place else. Now, I predict that what's going to happen is that perhaps those orders will now explode with
Yeah.
candidates.
I think they will. I think they will. And my take on this whole discussion really comes from a great line from Newman in his chapter on the mission of Saint Benedict. And he says this, he says, what the Catholic Church once has had, she never has lost. Right. Therefore it makes
Yeah.
zero sense. It makes zero sense for that which fed the faithful for several hundred years in its literal form and been far
And
far beyond that. Far
not
beyond
just
that.
fed the faithful spiritually, but inspired
That's right.
cathedrals.
That's right.
It
That's right.
inspired Gothic architecture. It
That's right.
inspired art, great art. It inspired Mozart to
Yeah.
write things.
So to me, it can only be interpreted as a rearguard action to try to stifle a counter vision that the people in power don't care for. And you can call me whatever you want on that score. I just calls them like I sees them. Right.
Yeah,
As you know, I'm not a theologian, but I'm somebody who watches patterns and I see things. And this is what it looks like. And I
but
think,
you're
and I have,
very educated theologically, so
well,
don't sell
I mean,
yourself
right.
short.
But
Yeah,
I mean, I know I'm just, but I'm just talking strictly as someone who watches things. Right. And what I'm
yeah.
watching unfold is the activity of rear guard thugs. That's what this is. Right.
I
And,
agree.
it disturbs me that those are the people in charge of our church.
Yeah, it's an attempt, I think, to control the narrative of things. It is a rearguard thuggery. I mean, once again, you don't attend a TLM. I don't attend a TLM. I personally like mass in the vernacular. I personally like prayers to be prayed out loud with dialogical responses from the congregation. All right. So I think that there are elements of the Novus Ordo that I prefer to the TLM, even though I think the Novus, but so I attend an Anglican ordinariate parish because I think it gets the best of both worlds, you know. But the point is I think, so what's so bad about having a plurality of differing rights when we have to have a single Roman rite? Well, we've never had a single Roman rite.
Right.
There have always
Right.
been alternative rites within the single Roman church, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and I would challenge anybody listening and angry at me or Larry right now. I would challenge them to really ask that question. Really ask that question.
Yeah.
What's the problem? Like seriously, what
Yeah.
is going on?
Because you know what? I'm not a huge fan of the TLM, but I have dear friends who are, and they are good people. Like you said before, spiritually faithful Catholics. What is wrong with them? I mean, that they have to be so cast. Where's the accompaniment? Where's the going to the peripheries? Where's the synodality? Where's all these buzzwords that this Vatican's always tossing around? Todos, everyone,
Right.
everyone, except for you Latin mass creeps.
Right.
Not you people, just James Martin and the LGBTQ crowd. which is really in many ways what a lot of this is about. But we don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
And it is, right. But so the bigger, sort of takeaways is, um how to find succor in such a catastrophe. I mean, that's where I am. And it would just be nice, honestly, it would be really nice if people in charge would just get a clue, just get a clue, man. So anyway.
Yeah. I
All right.
agree. And for those listening who say, oh, when these YouTube videos, I just interviewed Gavin Ashenden yesterday,
Oh yeah.
posted that up. And, lots of people love it. And then the other people say, oh my goodness, your attitude towards Pope Francis is just horrific. And how dare you? And bad you, bad you. I think he's the real Pope. I'm not a sedevacantist. All right. He is the Holy Father. I believe he's not a heretic and so on and so forth. But I think he's a really bad Pope. I'm just going to say it. I think, and I think we have a right to say that as Catholics.
I think so too. And to me, I've told you this before, but I'm in Camp Dante here. I'm in Camp Dante. I call balls and strikes. I want the Holy Father to be great. I want
Yeah.
Francis to be good. Like I really do. This gives me no pleasure. Like I don't want any of this crap, right? But
Yeah.
look, I get in front of kids every day. I get in front of parents all the time, and it becomes increasingly difficult to explain any of the perennial
Yeah.
elements of the faith, given the
Yeah.
confusion. And that's where that to me, that's where it begins and ends.
Well, I think
Confusion
you
is not
just
helpful.
nailed it. You nailed it there, though, when you said you want the Pope to do well.
Yeah.
I mean, the first 5 years of the Francis papacy, I was a big apologist for this. I was, a Pope splainer. I was
Right.
oh, this is what he meant, or that's what he meant, because I wanted the Pope to be well thought of. I wanted the Pope to
Right.
be good. I grew up under John Paul and Benedict. This is what but then I just reached a point of brute honesty where one grain of sand after another until you had a pile of sand, and you look at it and say, well, that's a pile of sand now, that's not just a grain, and you can't ignore it anymore. And so yeah, I decided to speak out. It's cost me some subscriptions here.
Sure. Sure.
It's cost me viewers, because I started my blog being very critical of traditionalists. And so people say, well, what happened to that chap? What happened to, well, I'm still critical of traditionalists. There's a lot to be
Yeah.
critical.
Way more than I am. Right. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, exactly.
we've talked about that.
Peter Kwasniewski's, a Facebook friend of mine. We chat, and all that. But I have strong disagreements with all that. I still do, but I think
But it's not the point.
and Peter would point this out, and I think he's right. And you sort of intimated this, the traditionalist movement is not that powerful. It's not that influential. It's a small enclave. It's a niche market for now, anyway. And the fact is, the reason why I rail lately more and more and more against the progressive wing of the church is because they're holding all the cards, and they're calling the shots. They're in charge. Okay. They're the ones with power. And that's why my focus is on them.
And to tie this up, they're the ones holding up the pictures of Rupnik.
Yes. Yeah. And let that be the end of our conversation. They're the ones holding up the pictures of Marco Rupnik.
Amen.
All right. And they've got some splaining to do. And it's very telling that Ruffini could not explain.
Yeah.
He could
only mock. He could only mock.
He could only mock. He couldn't explain.
Yeah. All right.
But anyway, well, thanks, folks, for listening. Kale, do you have any last words?
No, I'm good, man. You know me. Good.
Yeah. I mean, well, we have been at this about an hour and 50 minutes or so. This is awesome.
Have we really? Oh, dear.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, dear.
Like I said, I could talk to you for hours. And I know I always get great responses from my viewers when I have you on and so on. You're becoming a regular sidekick here. So that's great. But anyway, hey, thanks everyone for listening. And by the way, next week, I'm going to be interviewing Scott Hahn and a few other people. So there we go. All right. Thanks, everyone.
God bless.